In the rolling hills of northern Montana, where the wind carries secrets and the mountains hold their breath, there lived a man who spoke in barriers. Every morning, Colt Harrison would rise before dawn to tend his fences miles upon miles of cedar posts and wire that carved his world into manageable pieces. What he never counted on was the morning a stranger would slip through his carefully constructed boundaries, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and eyes that saw straight through the walls he'd built around his heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm never had a chance to sound. Colt Harrison's eyes opened at 4:47 a.m., same as they had every morning for the past 8 years, 3 minutes before the clock would dare disturb the silence of Ironwood Ranch. His calloused hands found the edge of the quilt his grandmother had stitched decades ago. Back when this land meant family dinners and Christmas mornings, instead of solitary coffee and the endless task of keeping the world at arm's length, the floorboards knew his weight, knew exactly where to creak and where to hold their silence. As he moved through the pre-dawn darkness of his bedroom, everything in the modest ranch house had its place, its purpose, its distance from everything else. The coffee maker sat precisely 12 inches from the sink. His boots waited by the Zinco. Back door, laces loose enough for quick entry, but tight enough to last a 14-hour day. His work gloves lay folded on the kitchen counter next to a stack of unopened mail that had grown thick with neglect. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endless and dark, punctured only by stars that seemed too far away to matter. The thermometer on the porch read 38 degrees, cold enough to make breath visible, but warm enough for the kind of work that would fill his day. Colt poured his coffee black, thick as motor oil, and stepped onto the porch that wrapped around 3 sides of his house like a defensive perimeter. The ranch spread out before him in the dim light, 2,847 acres of rolling pasture, timber stands, and creek bottom that his grandfather had bought with railroad money in 1952. Back then, it had been called Harmony Ranch, a name that made sense when 3 generations of Harrisons worked the land together, when the dinner table seated 8, and the barn dances lasted until sunrise. Now it was Ironwood Ranch, renamed after the trees that grew along the northern boundary. Trees so hard they could stop a bullet, and so stubborn they grew where nothing else would take root. Colt stood, 6 feet 4 inches in his stocking feet, shoulders broad enough to carry fence posts like they weighed nothing, hands large enough to palm a basketball, but gentle enough to set a bird's wing. His hair had started going gray at 28, not from age but from the weight of carrying a ranch alone, from the responsibility of maintaining something that had once been shared among many. His eyes, the color of storm clouds over wheat fields, held a steadiness that came from years of looking at horizons and seeing only work that needed doing. The barn sat 200 yards from the house. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, its tin roof patched in 17 places where hail had punched through during the storm of 19. Inside, his tools waited in perfect order, post-hole diggers arranged by size, rolls of barbed wire stacked according to gauge, fence stretchers hanging from hooks he'd welded himself during the long winter evenings, when the wind howled too loud for television and too cold for company. His truck, a 2018 Ford F350, with 127,000 miles and a dent in the left rear panel from an argument with a bull, sat loaded with the day's supplies. Fence posts cut from cedar grown on his own land, wire rolled tight as piano strings, staples sorted into coffee cans by length. The truck bed held the archaeology of a man who fixed more than he replaced, who believed that everything deserved a second chance except people who proved they didn't. The morning routine never varied. Coffee on the porch until the horizon began to separate itself from the sky. Walked the fence line closest to the house, checking for breaks, sags, or signs that something had tried to get in or get out. Feed the cattle that grazed in the home. Pasture, 43 head of Black Angus that knew his approach by the sound of his footsteps on frozen ground. Check the water tanks, the salt licks, the gates that divided his world into sections small enough to manage. By 6:30, the sun had pulled itself above the eastern ridge, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber that would have taken a painter. Months to capture. Colt loaded his tools and headed for the northwest section, where winter storms had loosened 3 posts and left a gap wide enough for trouble to walk through. The drive took 20 minutes across terrain that would challenge most vehicles, but his truck knew every rut, every stone, every place where the ground went soft after rain. The damaged fence stood at the edge of what locals called Widow's Draw, a steep-sided valley that cut through his property like a scar. The creek at the bottom ran clear and cold, fed by springs that had never run dry, even during the drought of '22, when half the county sold their cattle for whatever they could get. Ancient cottonwoods grew along the water's edge, their leaves whispering secrets in languages older than the fence posts that divided the land into mine and not mine. Colt parked the truck and surveyed the damage with the eye of a man who had repaired 10,000 breaks over the years. The middle post had snapped clean through, victim of a winter that had brought more ice than snow, more wind than any timber could withstand. The wire hung loose and useless, creating an invitation for deer, elk, cattle, or anything else that might wander where it didn't belong. He began with the post-hole digger, breaking through earth that had barely thawed from winter's grip. The rhythm of digging had become meditation over the years. Drive the blades down, twist, lift, dump the dirt to one side in a pile that would eventually fill the space around the new post. His breath came in steady puffs as he worked, each hole exactly 18 inches deep, exactly 6 inches wide, exactly the right size for the cedar post that would stand for another generation. The work was honest in a way that few things remained. Dig a hole, set a post, stretch the wire, secure it tight. No committees, no negotiations, no compromises with anyone's opinion about how it should be done. The fence would either keep things in or keep things out. It would either stand for decades or fall in the first strong wind. There was no middle ground in fence building, no partial success, no almost good enough that would satisfy the cattle or the weather or the simple physics of tension and compression. By 9:15, the first post stood plumb and true, its cedar heartwood already bleeding the aromatics that would help it resist rot, insects, and time itself. Colt moved to the second post, then the third, his movements economical and precise. Each hole received exactly the right amount of gravel for drainage, exactly the right tamp of soil for stability. The wire came next, stretched tight enough to sing in the wind, but not so tight that the first freeze would snap it like a guitar string tuned too high. The mountains watched his progress with the patience of geological time. Peak after peak stretched away to the north and west, some snow-capped even in late spring, others bare and brown like sleeping giants. They had witnessed 100 years of Harrison fence building, had seen his grandfather stretch the first wire across this same draw, had watched his father expand the boundaries until the ranch sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the state. They had also watched it shrink as economics and isolation took their toll. The south pasture was sold to pay medical bills. The east meadow traded for enough cash to replace machinery that had finally surrendered to rust and overwork. The hay fields were leased to neighbors who could afford the equipment to cut and bale what Colt could no longer handle alone. Each transaction had left him with good money and less land, more security, and smaller horizons. The fence repair took 3 hours and 47 minutes, start to finish. When Colt stepped back to inspect his work, the barrier stood straight and strong, each wire pulled to exactly the right tension, each staple driven to exactly the right depth. It looked like it had always been there, like the earth itself had decided this was where one thing ended and another began. He loaded his tools and drove to the next section, where last week's rain had undermined a corner post and left 20 yards of fence sagging like a hammock. The post came out easier than expected, its concrete footing cracked and useless after 15 years of freeze-thaw cycles. The new hole required different tools, a breaker bar to shatter the old concrete, a shovel to clear the debris, the post hole digger to reach the proper depth in soil that had been disturbed too many times. The replacement post was bigger than the original, a 10-inch diameter cedar log that would outlast the fence it anchored. Colt mixed concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow that had been his father's, adding gravel and water until the mixture reached the consistency of thick oatmeal. The post went in level and straight, braced with scrap lumber until the concrete could cure. The fence wire stretched tight and true, connected to its neighbors with sleeves that would hold longer than the wire itself. Lunch came from a cooler in the truck bed, sandwich thick with leftover roast, thermos of coffee that had stayed hot since morning, apple that had come from trees his grandmother planted behind the house. He ate sitting on the tailgate, looking out over pasture that rolled away toward the next ridge, toward fence lines that disappeared into distance and heat shimmer. Somewhere out there, cattle grazed in patterns that followed water and shade, moving across the land like thoughts across a quiet mind. The afternoon brought different work replacing insulators on an electric fence that kept the bulls separate from the main herd, tightening wire that had stretched during the winter, checking gates that opened and closed according to grazing rotation schedules that existed only in his memory. Each task required different tools, different techniques, different degrees of patience and precision. The electric fence had to be perfect or it was useless. A bull that learned to push through weak wire would teach the lesson to every animal. In the herd. By 4:30, the sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in colors that would fade by the time he reached the house. Colt loaded the last of his tools and headed home across terrain that had become as familiar as the lines on his hands. Every hill had a name, every draw had a story, every section of fence had a history of repairs and replacements that stretched back to his childhood. The house came into view as he crested the final hill, its lights already glowing against the gathering dusk. Motion sensors had triggered the porch lights, security lights, and the floods that illuminated the barn and equipment shed. The ranch might be isolated, might be surrounded by enough fence to make a prison, but it was safe, defendable, controllable, in ways that the rest of the world had never been. Dinner was simple steak from his own cattle, potatoes from the root cellar, green beans from the garden that had been his mother's pride and was now just another thing to maintain. He ate at the kitchen table, reading mail that had accumulated during the week, sorting bills from advertisements, keeping what mattered and discarding what didn't. The mortgage statement showed another month's progress toward ownership of land that had belonged to his family for 70 years. The bank might hold the paper, but the fence posts knew who drove them. The wire knew whose hands had stretched it tight. After dinner, he walked the fence line closest to the house, checking by flashlight what the daylight had revealed. Every post stood plumb, every wire sang with proper tension, every gate latched secure against the possibility of escape or intrusion. The perimeter was intact, the boundaries clear, the division between inside and outside as definite as a signature on a contract. The porch held his coffee and his thoughts as the last light faded from the sky. Stars emerged one by one, then by the dozens, then by the thousands until the Montana darkness blazed with more light than any city had ever produced. Out there beyond the fence, deer moved through the timber, elk grazed in meadows he would never see, and the world continued its ancient business of growth and decay, predator and prey, the endless cycle of things that had never learned to build barriers between themselves and everything else. The coffee grew cold in his hands as he planned tomorrow's work. 3 more sections to check, a gate that needed new hinges, a corner post that had begun to lean with age and weather, Always something to fix, something to strengthen, something to build higher or deeper or stronger than whatever might test. The fence was never finished, never perfect, never proof against everything that might challenge its authority to divide the world into manageable pieces. He rose from the porch chair and carried his cup inside, where the kitchen lights pushed back the darkness, and the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night provided the only company he had learned to trust. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of fence building, another opportunity to maintain the boundaries between his world and everything else that moved through the darkness beyond his carefully constructed perimeter. The bedroom held him like a fortress, its windows facing away from the road, its doors locked against intrusions that might come in the night. The quilt his grandmother had stitched covered him like a blessing, like a reminder that this land had once held more than one person, had once echoed with voices that called it home instead of simply territory to defend. But those voices had faded into memory, into photographs on the mantel, into fence lines that stretched toward horizons he would patrol alone until the earth reclaimed them all. Sleep came slowly, as it always did, interrupted by sounds that might mean something or nothing. Whined in the eaves, cattle moving in the pasture, the distant call of an owl hunting in timber that grew thick and dark beyond the northern boundary. Each sound required evaluation, classification, dismissal, or action, depending on its source and meaning. The ranch never truly slept, and neither did the man who had built his life around keeping it safe from everything that moved in the darkness beyond his fences. The morning arrived wrapped in fog, so thick Colt could barely see the barn from his kitchen window. May fog in Montana meant weather coming from the west, moisture rolling off the mountains like breath from sleeping giants. He postponed his usual fence check and decided to work on the equipment shed roof, where 3 loose shingles had been flapping like wings every time the wind picked up. The ladder felt solid against the shed wall as he climbed with his tool belt and a bundle of replacement shingles. From the roofline, he could see maybe 50 yards in any direction before the world disappeared into gray nothingness. The fog muffled the sound, made everything feel closer and farther away at the same time. Even his own breathing seemed louder than it should. He had just pried loose the first damaged shingle when he heard something that didn't belong, the distinct crack of a branch breaking under weight, coming from somewhere near the creek bottom. Not the snap of deadfall settling, but the sharp report of green wood giving way under pressure. Something large was moving through the timber, something that didn't know the land well enough to avoid the alder thickets that grew thick as prison bars along the water. Colt set down his hammer and listened. Another crack, this one followed by what sounded like fabric tearing on thorns. Then silence so complete it made his ears ring. Whatever had been moving down there had either stopped or learned to move more carefully. He climbed down from the roof and walked toward the fence line that marked the northern boundary of his property. The fog swirled around him like living smoke, revealing glimpses of fence posts and wire before swallowing them again. At the boundary, he stopped and listened again. "Hello." The voice came from perhaps 30 yards away, female, cautious but not frightened. "Is someone there?" Colt's hand found the fence wire automatically, fingers checking the tension out of habit. He could see nothing beyond the first strand of barbed wire, but the voice had been clear, articulated with the precise diction of someone who had learned to speak carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're on private property," he called back, his voice carrying farther than he expected in the dense air. "There's a fence here. I can see that now." A pause then. "I'm afraid I may have damaged your barrier getting through. I'm sorry." "Damaged your barrier. Not broke your fence or tore your wire, but damaged your barrier." Like she understood that the fence meant more than just keeping cattle contained. "Where did you come through?" Colt asked. About. I'm not sure. Everything looks the same in this fog. I was following the creek, and suddenly there was wire wrapped around my jacket. The creek ran for nearly 2 miles along his northern boundary. She could have crossed anywhere, but the alder thickets only grew thick in 3 places near the old bridge foundation, by the beaver ponds, and where the spring fed into the main channel. The spring crossing had the lowest fence, built more to mark the boundary than to stop anything determined to get through. "Stay where you are," Colt said. "I'll come to you." He followed the fence line north, one hand trailing along the top wire to guide him through the fog. His boots found the familiar path worn smooth by years of fence checks, avoiding the gopher holes and loose stones that could turn an ankle. After 5 minutes of walking, he heard movement again, the careful sounds of someone trying not to make noise. The fog thinned as he approached the spring, revealing shapes that gradually resolved into recognizable landmarks. The old oak that had been struck by lightning. The boulder his grandfather had been unable to move when he built the first fence. And there, sitting on the ground with her back against the boulder, was a woman wearing what had once been a navy blue jacket. She looked to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes the color of moss after rain. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder where barbed wire had caught it, and her jeans bore fresh mud stains from creek crossings. She held a leather satchel in her lap like it contained something precious, protecting it even as she dealt with her own scratches and tears. "You found me," she said, standing as he approached. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with the kind of lean build that came from walking long distances rather than gym memberships. "I really am sorry about your fence. I can pay for repairs." Colt examined the fence line and found where she had crossed. 3 strands of wire had been pulled down and twisted, but none were broken. The post stood firm. The wire still held its memory of tension. 5 minutes with fence pliers would restore it to proper condition. "No damage," he said. "Wires just displaced." "That's generous of you." She adjusted the strap of her satchel and looked around at the landscape emerging from the fog. "This is a beautiful country. You're lucky to live here." Lucky, as if isolation was a blessing instead of a choice made necessary by circumstances beyond control. As if building fences around 3,000 acres was the same as winning a lottery instead of constructing a prison with himself as the only inmate. "You're lost," Colt said. It wasn't a question. "Temporarily misplaced," she corrected with a slight smile. "I'm a cartographer. I was mapping the creek system for the county survey when the fog rolled in. I thought I could follow the water back to the road, but—" She gestured at the gray wall that surrounded them, thicker now than when she had first called out. The fog had weight here in the mountain valleys, substance that could hide entire landscapes and rearrange familiar terrain into foreign geography. "Road's 3 miles southwest," Colt said. "You won't find it in this." "I was afraid of that." She looked at him directly, her moss-green eyes steady and unafraid. "I don't suppose you could point me toward the nearest shelter? I have emergency gear, but I'd rather not spend the night wrapped in a space blanket if there's an alternative." A cartographer. Someone whose job required understanding boundaries, elevations, the relationship between natural features and human constructions. Someone who would recognize the difference between a fence built to contain livestock and one designed to define territory with mathematical precision. "My ranch house is a 1/4 mile south," Colt heard himself say. "You can wait there until the fog lifts." The words had emerged without conscious decision, bypassing the careful consideration he applied to every choice about who entered his property and under what circumstances. The invitation hung in the air between them like the fog itself, visible but insubstantial, real but temporary. "That's very kind," she said. "I'm Elena Vasquez, by the way. And I promise I'm not in the habit of trespassing on private property." Elena Vasquez. Spanish surname, but her accent belonged to somewhere in the upper Midwest, Minnesota or Wisconsin, where people learned to speak slowly and clearly through long winters. Her handshake was firm, calloused from outdoor work, the grip of someone who handled surveying equipment and climbed difficult terrain for a living. "Colt Harrison," he said, and immediately regretted offering his name. Names created connections, obligations, the possibility of future contact. Better to remain anonymous, to help her find her way and disappear back into the fog from which she had emerged. They walked south along the fence line, the fog closing behind them like water healing around a wound. Elena moved carefully but confidently, watching where she placed her feet but not hesitating over rough ground. She carried herself like someone accustomed to uncertain terrain, someone who had learned to trust her balance and judgment in places where mistakes could be expensive. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as they walked. 8 years. The answer came automatically, then expanded against his better judgment. "My family has owned this land for 70 years. And you run cattle?" "Some. Mostly I maintain." "The property." She nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if she understood the difference between operating a ranch and simply keeping one functional. The fog swirled around them as they walked, revealing and concealing fence posts, trees, the creek that babbled somewhere off to their left. Elena moved through the gray world like she belonged there, like fog was just another type of weather rather than an impediment to navigation. "The fence construction is impressive," she said, running her hand along the top wire as they walked. "Most ranchers use standard T-posts and field fence. This is custom work." Colt glanced at her, surprised by the observation. The fence was custom work, built to specifications that had nothing to do with cattle management and everything to do with creating barriers that would discourage casual intrusion. The posts were cedar cut from his own timber, spaced closer than necessary, braced at intervals that reflected engineering rather than economy. "Stock fencing wouldn't hold up to the weather here," he said, which was true but not the whole truth. "The spacing suggests you're containing something smaller than cattle," Elena said. "Or keeping something out that's more determined than deer." Her professional eye had seen through the fence's ostensible purpose to its real function. She understood that the barrier had been designed by someone who took boundary maintenance seriously, who believed that good fences required more than the minimum effort necessary to satisfy immediate needs. The fog began to thin as they approached the ranch buildings, revealing the house first as a darker gray shape against the lighter gray air, then gradually resolving into windows, porch posts, a metal roof that shed water efficiently but noisily during rainstorms. Elena stopped when the full structure became visible, her cartographer's eye taking in details that most visitors would miss. "That's a well-built house," she said. "Good foundation, proper drainage around the basement. Someone knew what they were doing." "My grandfather built it in 1954, Colt said. "My father added the back wing in 82. "And you maintain it alone?" The question carried no judgment, just professional curiosity about the logistics of maintaining structures in remote locations. But it touched on the reality he had spent 8 years constructing around himself, the deliberate choice to handle everything personally rather than invite others onto his property, into his routines, into the carefully balanced system he had created to function without external variables. "Mostly," he said. They reached the porch as the fog swirled thick again, cutting visibility back to arm's length. Elena followed him up the steps, her boots making different sounds than his on the painted boards, lighter, less familiar with the spots that creaked and the places where the boards had warped enough to catch rainwater. "Please come in," Colt said, opening the door and immediately questioning the wisdom of inviting a stranger into the space he had spent years organizing according to his precise specifications. Elena stepped into the mudroom and looked around, with the same careful attention she had given the fence and the house exterior. Her eyes noted the neat rows of boots, the hooks holding work clothes sorted by season and function, the bench where someone could sit to change from outdoor footwear to house shoes. "May I?" she asked, indicating her mud-stained boots. "Of course." She pulled off her boots and set them neatly beside the door, then followed him into the kitchen. The room revealed itself to her gradually, the coffee maker in its designated spot, the cast-in skillet hanging exactly where his father had hung it, the table that had seated 8 when the ranch supported 3 generations, and now accommodated 1 person with room to spare. "This is lovely," Elena said, running her hand over the worn wooden countertop that had been cut from a single oak beam. "You can feel the history in a place like this." She accepted his offer of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while he prepared. Her presence somehow both intrusive and natural in the space that had held only his own movements for so long. The coffee ritual required adjustment, 2 mugs instead of 1, consideration of how someone else might prefer their coffee, awareness of being observed during activities he normally performed in solitude. "Do you mind if I ask what brings a cartographer to this particular creek system?" Colt asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own mug. "The county is updating their floodplain maps," Elena said. "Federal requirements changed, so they need new surveys of all the major watersheds. This creek feeds into the Yellowstone drainage, so it's part of the project. And you do this work alone?" "Usually. Sometimes I'll have a partner for really remote areas, but most of the time, it's just me and my equipment." She gestured toward the satchel she had protected during her fence crossing. "GPS units, measuring devices, cameras. Everything I need to create accurate maps of water flow and elevation." The fog had thickened again outside the kitchen windows, reducing the world to the dimensions of the house itself. Elena sipped her coffee and looked around the room with the careful observation of someone trained to notice details that others would miss. "You've done a lot of work to this place," she said. "The original structure is solid, but someone has made thoughtful improvements. Better insulation, updated electrical, modern plumbing, integrated carefully with the vintage fixtures." Her observations were accurate but disturbing in their precision. She could read the ranch buildings like maps, interpreting the layers of construction and modification that told the story of 3 generations of Harrisons adapting to changing needs and circumstances. "My father was handy," Colt said. "I've continued some of his projects. The fence system must represent years of work. It's ongoing." Elena nodded as if she understood the difference between a project that could be completed and a commitment that would last as long as the land remained in his possession. She seemed to grasp that the fences meant more than their practical function, that they represented something essential to the man who had built them. "I've mapped ranches all over the state," she said. "Yours is unusual. Most operations focus on maximizing grazing efficiency or adapting to natural terrain features. Your boundaries seem designed around different priorities." She was right, and her recognition of that fact made Colt uncomfortable in ways he couldn't name. The fence system had been designed to create security rather than efficiency, to establish control rather than accommodate livestock movement. Someone with her professional training could see through the ostensible purpose to the underlying motivation. "Weather's the main concern here," he said. "Snow loads, wind, freeze-thaw cycles. The fences have to be stronger than normal. That makes sense." But her tone suggested she understood there was more to the story than weather. Resistance. They sat in silence as the fog pressed against the windows, and the kitchen clock marked the passage of minutes with mechanical precision. Elena seemed comfortable with quiet, not compelled to fill every pause with conversation. She held her coffee mug in both hands and looked out at the gray wall that had transformed the familiar world into something alien and temporary. "How long does fog like this usually last?" she asked. "Could lift in an hour, could last all day. Depends on the wind and what's happening up in the high country. Then I may be imposing on your hospitality longer than planned." The word imposing suggested she understood that his invitation had been offered out of necessity rather than desire for company. She seemed to recognize that the ranch functioned according to routines that did not normally accommodate unexpected guests. "You're welcome to stay until it clears," Colt said, the words emerging despite his general policy of maintaining solitude. "Thank you. I have some work I can do while I wait." She opened her satchel and removed a tablet computer, survey notebooks, and other equipment that spoke of precision and professional competence. "If you don't mind, I could update my maps with the data I collected before the fog rolled in." She worked quietly at the kitchen table, occasionally referring to handwritten notes or consulting digital files on her tablet. Her concentration was complete but not excluding. She remained aware of Colt's movements around the kitchen, acknowledging his presence without requiring interaction. The fog began to thin around noon, revealing glimpses of the barn, the equipment shed, the fence, lines that stretched away toward invisible boundaries. Elena looked up from her work and watched the landscape emerge from its gray concealment, like a photograph developing in slow motion. "It's remarkable how different everything looks when the fog lifts," she said, "like the world recreating itself." "Different. Every time," Colt agreed. "Never quite the same as before." Elena packed her equipment carefully, each item finding its designated place in the satchel, with the efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light and keep track of valuable tools. She pulled on her boots in the mudroom and shouldered her pack with movements that spoke of long experience with outdoor work. "Thank you for the shelter and the coffee," she said, "and for not treating me like a criminal for crossing your fence." "Gates at the south corner if you need to cross again," Colt said, surprising himself with the offer of future access. "I may take you up on that. The creek system continues onto your property for another mile or so." They stood on the porch as the fog retreated toward the mountains, pulling back like a tide to reveal the ranch in full detail. Elena looked out over the emerging landscape with professional appreciation for its geography and personal pleasure in its beauty. "You've built something impressive here," she said. "Not just the fences, but the whole operation. It must be satisfying to create something this complete. As if she could see that the ranch represented more than agricultural enterprise, that it functioned as a self-contained world designed to operate independently of external influences or complications. "It serves its purpose," Colt said. Elena smiled at his understatement. "I imagine it does." She walked away across the clearing ground, her figure gradually diminishing as she followed the fence line back toward the creek crossing. Colt watched until she disappeared into the timber, then continued watching the empty landscape for several minutes longer. The house felt different when he returned to the kitchen, larger and smaller at the same time, familiar but somehow altered by the presence of someone who had observed it with fresh eyes. The coffee mug sat on the counter, one still carrying the warmth of his hands, the other cooling but retaining evidence of Elena's brief occupation of his carefully ordered space. He washed both mugs and returned them to their designated places. But the routine felt mechanical rather than satisfying. The kitchen had been designed for solitude, organized around the movements and preferences of one person. But for several hours, it had accommodated conversation, shared coffee, the presence of someone whose professional competence commanded respect. That evening, as he walked his usual fence check, Colt found himself looking toward the northern boundary more often than necessary. The wire stood properly tensioned, the posts remained plumb and secure, but the barrier felt different somehow, less like a fortification and more like a boundary that someone might cross again with legitimate purpose. The fog had lifted completely. By sunset, revealing the mountains in sharp detail against a sky that promised clear weather for the next several days. Good weather for outdoor work, for surveying creeks and updating maps, for activities that might require crossing fence lines in pursuit of accurate geographical information. At the spring crossing, Colt stopped to examine the wire that Elena had displaced during her morning passage. The repair would take 5 minutes, but he found himself leaving it as she had left it, not broken, just temporarily disturbed by someone who had apologized for the intrusion and treated his property with more respect than many invited guests had shown. The fence could wait another day for repair. Sometimes boundaries were meant to be crossed by people who understood their significance and respected their purpose. Sometimes the most carefully constructed barriers served their true function not by keeping everyone out, but by determining who deserved to be let in. Elena returned 4 days later, arriving at the south gate just after sunrise with her surveying equipment and a thermos that steamed in the cool mountain air. Colt saw her approach from the kitchen window and found himself checking his appearance in the hallway. Mirror a gesture he hadn't made in years, automatic and immediately regretted. She waited at the gate without attempting to open it, respecting the boundary even though he had given her permission to cross. When he walked down to meet her, she was studying the gate mechanism with professional interest, noting the heavy-duty hinges and the lock system that was more elaborate than necessary for keeping cattle contained. "Good morning," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting your routine." "Just starting fence checks," Colt replied, which was true but incomplete. He had been starting fence checks at exactly this time for 8 years, but today he had found himself hoping she might appear before he finished his coffee. "The creek continues onto your property for about 1.5 miles," Elena said, unfolding a topographical map that showed the watershed in precise detail. "If you don't mind, I'd like to survey the upper sections today. The county needs complete elevation data for the flood modeling." Her finger traced the blue line that represented water flowing through his land, past places he knew intimately but had never seen marked on official maps. The creek had carved its channel through his property long before there were surveys or county records, following the path of least resistance through terrain that geological forces had shaped over millennia. "Rough country up there," Colt said. "Lots of deadfall from the winter storms. I'm used to difficult terrain." Elena shouldered her pack with movements that spoke of long experience with heavy equipment and uncertain footing. "But if you're checking fences in that direction anyway." The invitation hung between them, unfinished but clear. She could navigate the upper creek alone, but the work would be easier and safer with someone who knew the land intimately. Colt found himself nodding before he had consciously decided to alter his daily routine to accommodate her presence. They walked north together, following the fence line that paralleled the creek through increasingly steep terrain. Elena moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent years working in remote locations, but she also observed everything with the trained eye of a professional surveyor, noting elevation changes, soil composition, the relationship between natural features and human improvements. "Your grandfather chose his boundaries well," she said as they climbed toward a ridge that offered views of 3 different drainages. "The fence follows natural terrain features that would make sense even without surveying equipment." He was a railroad man before he bought this land, Colt said. Understood grades and drainage from laying track through mountain country. That explains the engineering approach. Most ranchers just follow section lines regardless of topography. They reached a place where the creek tumbled through a narrow canyon, the water white and loud as it carved its way through granite that had resisted erosion for countless centuries. Elena set up her equipment on a flat shelf of rock, adjusting her instruments with the precise movements of someone whose measurements had to be accurate to within inches across distances measured in miles. Colt watched her work, impressed by her competence and the quality of her equipment. The GPS unit looked military-grade. The transit was precision-built German engineering, and her field notebook was filled with data recorded in handwriting so neat it could have been printed by machine. "How did you get into this work?" he asked during a break in her measurements. Elena looked up from her calculations, pencil still poised over the notebook page covered with numbers and sketches. "Started in the Army, actually. Military intelligence." Mapping terrain in places where accurate maps could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. Overseas? Afghanistan mostly. 3 tours between 2012 and 2018. She made another notation, then looked out over the canyon where water had carved stone into shapes that would outlast any human construction. Turns out the skills translate well to civilian surveying, and the work keeps me outdoors without people shooting at me. The information explains several things Colt had noticed: her comfort with solitude, her systematic approach to unfamiliar terrain, the way she carried herself with alert awareness that never quite relaxed into casualness. Military training left marks that lasted long after the uniform came off. Must have been difficult, he said, some of it. Elena adjusted her equipment and took another reading, her movements economical and practiced. But it taught me to pay attention to details, to understand that small mistakes can have large consequences. Useful skills for mapping floodplains. They continued up the canyon, Elena stopping every few hundred yards to take readings and record data while Colt checked fence sections that saw little traffic, except from elk and the occasional black bear. The fence in this section was built lighter than near the ranch buildings, still well constructed, but designed more to mark boundaries than to stop determined intrusion. The fence construction changes as you get farther from the house, Elena observed. Closer spacing near the buildings, different materials in different sections. Her professional eye missed nothing, reading the fence system like a book that told the story of its builder's priorities and concerns. Colt realized she could probably map his psychology as accurately as she mapped the creek system, identifying the places where security mattered most and the areas where simple boundary marking sufficed. Different threats require different solutions, he said. And what threats are you protecting against out here? The question was asked casually, but Colt sensed the professional curiosity behind it. Elena had spent years analyzing terrain for defensive purposes, identifying vulnerabilities and potential approaches. She would naturally wonder why a cattle rancher had invested in fortress-level perimeter security. Mostly weather, he said, which was true but insufficient. Elena nodded as if accepting the explanation, but her eyes continued to study the fence. Construction with the analytical gaze of someone who understood the difference between barriers built to contain livestock and barriers built to control access. They reached the upper end of the canyon, where the creek emerged from a series of beaver ponds that created a complex system of channels and wetlands. Elena set up her equipment in the meadow beyond the ponds, taking measurements that would help county engineers predict how water would behave during spring floods and storm events. "This is a beautiful country," she said during another break in her work. "You're fortunate to have it to yourself." "Wasn't always to myself," Colt found himself saying, the words emerging before he could stop them. Elena looked up from her field notebook, waiting without pressure for him to continue or change the subject. Her military experience had probably taught her to recognize when people needed to talk and when they needed silence. "My parents lived here until 5 years ago," Colt said. "Dad had a stroke, needed more medical care than we could manage this far from town. They moved to Billings, closer to the hospital and specialists. That must have been a difficult transition, for all of us." Colt picked up a stone and skipped it across the beaver pond, watching the ripples spread in perfect circles until they reached the shore. The ranch had been in the family for 70 years. 3 generations working the same land, building the same fences, running cattle through the same pastures. "And then you were alone here. At first, I thought it would be temporary. Dad would recover, they'd come back, things would return to normal." Another stone found the water, this one sinking immediately instead of skipping. "But strokes don't work that way. Dad needed full-time care, and Mom needed to be where she could get help caring for him." Elena packed her equipment methodically, each piece finding its designated place in her pack. "Did you consider moving closer to them?" "For a while." Colt helped her shoulder the pack, their hands brushing briefly as he adjusted the straps. But someone had to maintain the ranch. The land, the buildings, the fences. 70 years of work doesn't take care of itself. They began the descent back toward the ranch buildings, following a different route that took them along the eastern fence line, through stands of aspen that had begun to turn yellow with early autumn color. The conversation continued in fragments, pieces of history shared between fence checks and equipment adjustments. The isolation was harder than I expected, Colt admitted as they passed through a gate that separated the upper pasture from the home section. Not the physical work I'd been doing that since I was old enough to carry fence posts, but the silence. The house had always been full of voices, 3 generations talking over each other at dinner. Suddenly, it was just me and the radio weather reports. How did you adapt? Built more fences. The answer surprised him with its honesty. Started with necessary repairs, then improvements, then sections that weren't really needed, but gave me something to focus on. Turns out fence building is good therapy for dealing with loneliness. Elena stopped walking and turned to look back at the fence line they had just traversed, seeing it now with new understanding. The construction quality makes more sense now. You weren't just maintaining boundaries, you were creating purpose. Something like that. They reached a section where the fence crossed a rocky outcrop, requiring specialized anchoring techniques that Colt had learned through trial and error. Elena examined the installation with professional appreciation, noting how he had adapted standard construction methods to challenging terrain. "This is excellent work," she said. "You could teach courses in advanced fence construction. Plenty of time to practice, and plenty of motivation to get it right." They continued toward the ranch buildings as the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Elena worked steadily, taking readings and recording data while Colt checked gates and wire tension with automatic efficiency. The routine had become so familiar he could perform it, while thinking about other things like how different the work felt with someone else present, how conversation made the miles pass faster than solitary contemplation. "The fence system extends. For how many miles total?" Elena asked as they approached the final measurement point of the day. "Just under 12 miles of boundary fence, plus another 8 miles of interior divisions," Colt said. "All of it built or rebuilt in the last 5 years. That's an enormous amount of work for one person. Gave me something to do besides feel sorry for myself." Elena finished her measurements and packed her equipment as the sun began to set behind the western peaks. The day's work had taken them over most of Colt's northern boundary, mapping creek sections that few people had ever seen while checking fence lines that represented thousands of hours of solitary labor. "I'll need to return tomorrow to complete the survey," Elena said as they reached the south gate. "The creek system continues onto the Meadowlark Ranch property, but I'll need to cross your land to reach it." "Gate will be unlocked," Colt said. "Or you can come by the house if you want coffee before you start." The invitation emerged naturally, without the careful consideration he usually applied to any decision that might complicate his routines. Elena smiled and adjusted her pack straps, preparing for the walk back to her truck parked on the county road. "I might take you up on that," she said. "Early mornings are easier with good coffee." She walked away into the gathering dusk, her figure gradually disappearing into the shadows cast by fence posts and trees. Colt remained at the gate for several minutes after she was gone, looking out over land that felt somehow different than it had that morning. Still his, still secure behind miles of carefully constructed barriers, but no longer quite as isolated as before. That evening, he found himself thinking about military service while he prepared dinner in a kitchen that had seemed too large for one person until Elena had sat at the table with her maps and measuring equipment. 3 tours in Afghanistan meant she had seen combat, had dealt with threats more serious than weather and isolation, had learned to function under pressures that made ranch maintenance seem peaceful by comparison. The revelation explained her. professional competence, her comfort with difficult terrain, and her understanding of the difference between necessary security and excessive caution. Someone who had mapped terrain for military purposes would recognize fortress construction when she saw it, would understand that his fence system had been designed by someone who valued control over convenience. After dinner, he walked the fence line closest to the house, checking wire tension and post stability by flashlight, as he had done every evening for 5 years. But tonight the routine felt different, less like compulsive maintenance and more like responsible stewardship of land that might someday be shared with someone who understood its value. At the north gate, he stopped to examine the lock mechanism that Elena had studied that morning. The hardware was indeed more elaborate than necessary for cattle management, designed to discourage casual entry, while remaining functional for authorized access. Tomorrow he would unlock it as promised, creating an opening in barriers that had been closed to outside entry for longer than he cared to calculate. The mountains held their silence as he completed his evening rounds, stars emerging one by one in a sky clear enough to read by. Somewhere beyond his fence lines, Elena was probably updating her field notes, transferring the day's measurements to digital files that would become part of official county records. Her work would create maps that showed his property boundaries with precision he had never seen, documenting the relationship between natural features and human constructions, with accuracy measured in inches rather than approximate feet. Back in the house, he found himself looking at the kitchen table where she had spread her maps and equipment, remembering how natural her presence had seemed despite the careful order he had imposed on every aspect of his domestic routine. Military discipline had taught her to adapt quickly to new environments, to function efficiently within constraints designed by others, to accomplish necessary tasks without disrupting existing systems. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by thoughts of conversations that had revealed more about his own motivations than years of solitary self-examination. Building fences as therapy for loneliness, maintaining boundaries as a way of creating purpose. Elena had understood connections he had never articulated, had recognized patterns he had never consciously acknowledged. Tomorrow she would return for coffee and conversation before continuing her survey work. The prospect felt both comfortable and unsettling, like the approach of weather that might bring needed rain or destructive storms. Change was coming to the carefully controlled environment he had spent 5 years constructing, and for the first time since his parents had moved away, he found himself curious rather than concerned about what that change might bring. Elena arrived before sunrise the next morning, her truck's headlights sweeping across the ranch yard as she parked near the equipment shed. Colt watched from the kitchen window as she gathered her gear with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to work in darkness, her silhouette moving purposefully through the pre-dawn gloom. He had been awake for an hour, unable to sleep past 4:30, despite staying up later than usual to repair a section of interior fence that had been nagging at him for weeks. The coffee was already brewing when she knocked softly on the back door, and he found himself pleased that his timing had been accurate. "You're an early riser," Elena said, accepting the mug he offered with hands that showed fresh scratches from yesterday's work through timber and brush. "Habit from growing up here," Colt replied. "Cattle don't care what time you went to bed. Militaries the same way. Dawn comes when it comes, regardless of how much sleep you've had." She wore different clothes today, canvas pants instead of jeans, a field jacket with multiple pockets for equipment, boots that showed the kind of wear that came from years of walking rough country. Her hair was braided back in a practical style that would stay out of her face during a long day of surveying work. "How far does the creek extend onto the neighboring property?" Colt asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own coffee. "About 3 miles before it joins Willow Creek," Elena said, unfolding a map that showed the entire watershed in detailed contour lines. "The Meadowlark Ranch boundaries follow the ridge system, so I'll need to survey the tributaries that feed in from the north slope." Her finger traced blue lines that represented water flowing through terrain Colt knew by reputation, but had never seen. The Meadowlark Ranch had been owned by the Sullivan family for 40 years, managed as a hunting operation rather than a working cattle ranch. Good neighbors in the sense that they kept to themselves and maintained their boundaries, but distant in the way that large properties allowed. Rough country over there, Colt said. Lots of bear sign in those drainage systems. I've worked in bear country before. Afghanistan had different predators, but the principles are similar. Stay alert, make noise when visibility is limited, carry appropriate deterrence. She opened her field notebook to pages covered with yesterday's measurements, checking calculations with the systematic thoroughness of someone whose work had to be precise enough to matter. Her handwriting was remarkably neat for someone who worked outdoors in all weather, each number and symbol placed with deliberate care. The elevation data from your property shows some interesting patterns, Alina said, pointing to a series of measurements recorded near the canyon section. The creek drops nearly 200 feet in elevation over the 1.5 miles that crosses your land. That's significant gradient for flood modeling. Spring runoff gets pretty dramatic up there. Colt agreed. I've seen the creek run 10 feet higher than normal when the snow melts fast, which is exactly why the county needs accurate mapping. Climate change is making weather patterns less predictable, so the old flood models aren't reliable anymore. The conversation continued as they finished their coffee, Elena explaining the technical aspects of her work while Colt provided local knowledge about seasonal water patterns and historical flood events. Her questions were intelligent and specific, drawing on his lifetime of observation to supplement the mathematical precision of her measurements. When they left the house, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, but the stars remained visible overhead, sharp and clear in the thin mountain air. Elena shouldered her pack with practiced efficiency, while Colt loaded fence repair materials into his truck, planning to work on the eastern boundary while she surveyed the upper creek sections. I'll probably be on Meadowlark property most of the day, Elena said as they walked toward the north gate. But I'll stop by on my way out if that's convenient. Gate will be unlocked, Colt said, though he planned to be working within sight of the access point for most of the afternoon. They separated at the creek crossing, Elena heading upstream toward increasingly steep terrain while Colt turned east toward fence sections that had suffered winter damage in the exposed areas above timberline. The morning work went quickly, replacing insulators on an electric fence, retentioning wire that had stretched during freeze-thaw cycles, checking the solar charger that powered the system. By mid-morning, he found himself looking toward the ridgeline that separated his property from the Meadowlark Ranch, wondering how Elena's survey work was progressing through terrain that challenged even experienced outdoors people. The North Slope country was beautiful but unforgiving, with sudden elevation changes and deadfall that could trap the unwary around noon. He drove back toward the house to get lunch and check on equipment that had been running unsupervised all morning. As he crested the hill above the ranch buildings, he noticed Elena's truck parked near the equipment shed. Much earlier than he had expected her return, he found her sitting on the tailgate of her truck, field jacket off and sleeves rolled up, examining what appeared to be a significant tear in the canvas fabric. Her left forearm showed a scrape that had bled enough to require the bandana currently wrapped around it. Run into some trouble? Colt asked, noting the mud on her boots and the pine needles in her hair that suggested an unplanned encounter with difficult terrain. Got a little too close to a mama bear with cubs, Elena said, holding up the torn jacket. Had to make a quick exit through some deadfall that wasn't marked on any of my maps. Anyone hurt besides your jacket? Just my pride and this scratch. She unwrapped the bandana to reveal a clean cut that had already stopped bleeding. The bear was more interested in moving her cubs away from me than causing problems, but I decided discretion was the better part of valor. Colt examined the tear in her jacket, noting that the canvas had been shredded by something with very sharp claws. "You'll need a new jacket before you finish the survey work. Probably. This one's seen me through 3 years of field work, but I don't think it's repairable. Come on up to the house," Colt said. "I've got something that might work." Elena followed him to the house, where he led her to a closet in the back hallway that held outdoor gear accumulated over decades of ranch work. He pulled out a field jacket that had belonged to his father, heavy canvas with reinforced elbows and pockets, designed for carrying tools and equipment. "This should fit," he said, holding it up for her inspection. "My dad was about your size, and it's built for serious outdoor work." Elena accepted the jacket and tried it on, finding that the sleeves were exactly the right length and the shoulders provided room for the layered clothing necessary for mountain weather. The canvas was soft with age but still waterproof, and the pockets were perfectly positioned for surveying equipment. "This is beautiful work," she said, examining the construction details. "Hand-sewn reinforcements, quality hardware. They don't make them like this anymore. Dad bought it in 1978, wore it for 25 years of ranch work. It's been hanging in that closet since he moved to Billings. I can't accept something with that much personal history. It's designed to be used, not preserved in a closet." Colt said, "Dad would appreciate seeing it back in the field instead of gathering dust." Elena wore the jacket for the rest of the afternoon, and it transformed her appearance in subtle ways that took Colt a while to identify. The canvas was darker than her original jacket, and the cut was more masculine, but it seemed to suit her practical approach to outdoor work. More importantly, it connected her to the ranch in a way that her own gear never could. She finished her survey work on his property that afternoon, taking final measurements near the southern boundary where the creek crossed onto the neighboring ranch. Colt worked within sight of her position, replacing fence staples and checking wire tension while keeping half his attention focused on her progress through familiar terrain. "All finished on your property," Elena announced when she returned to the ranch yard near sunset. "I'll need another day or two to complete the tributary mapping on Meadowlark, but the hard work is done. How did the jacket work out?" "Perfect. Better than my original, actually. The pockets are positioned exactly right for GPS units and measuring equipment." She patted one of the chest pockets where her notebook fit precisely. "Your father had good taste in work clothes." They stood in the ranch yard as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in colors that would fade within minutes, but seemed to last forever in memory. Elena had packed her equipment for the final time on his property, but she showed no urgency to leave despite the approaching darkness. "I want to show you something," Colt said, leading her toward the barn where he kept equipment that wasn't used for daily ranch operations. Inside the barn, he pulled a canvas tarp off an object that had been covered for several years. Underneath was a vintage surveying transit, brass and steel construction from the 1940s, mounted on a wooden tripod that showed decades of careful maintenance. "This belonged to my grandfather," Colt said. "He used it to survey his own property lines when he bought the ranch, then later to help neighbors establish boundaries when the county records were unreliable." Elena approached the instrument with the reverence of someone who understood both its historical significance and its precision engineering. She ran her fingers over the brass fittings and examined the optical system with professional appreciation. "This is museum quality," she said. "A Wild Herebrud T1, probably manufactured around 1947. These were the gold standard for precision surveying before electronic instruments. He taught my father to use it, and Dad taught me basic surveying when I was in high school. I haven't had it out in years, but it's still calibrated and functional. Would you mind if I set it up? I'd love to see how it compares to modern GPS accuracy." They carried the transit outside and set it up in the ranch yard, Elena adjusting the leveling screws with the careful precision of someone who had learned to operate similar instruments under field conditions. The ancient brass and steel mechanism responded to her touch like it had been waiting years for someone who understood its purpose. "The optics are incredible," Elena said, peering through the eyepiece and adjusting the focus to bring distant fence posts into sharp detail. "Better glass than some modern instruments I've used." Colt watched her work with equipment that represented 3 generations of Harrison family history, noting how naturally she adapted to the mechanical precision required by analog instruments. Her military training had probably included experience with equipment designed to function without electronic support, tools that could work in environments where batteries failed and satellite signals disappeared. "Take a reading on that corner post," he suggested, pointing toward a fence corner he had surveyed dozens of times with modern equipment. Elena made the measurements with practiced efficiency, recording numbers in her field notebook while talking through the process of using mechanical instruments for precision surveying. When she finished, she compared her readings to GPS coordinates from her electronic equipment. "Within 2 inches over 400 yards, she announced. "Your grandfather's transit is more accurate than it has any right to be after 75 years. He maintained it like his life depended on it. Cleaned and calibrated it every year, kept it covered and dry, never let anyone else operate it without supervision. Smart man. Instruments like this can last centuries if they're cared for properly." They packed the transit carefully and returned it to its place in the barn, covering it again with the canvas tarp that had protected it from dust and moisture. The evening had grown cool enough for jacket weather, and Elena pulled his father's canvas field coat closer around her shoulders. "I should probably head back to town," she said. "Early start tomorrow to finish the Meadowlark survey work." "You're welcome to camp here if it would be more convenient," Colt heard himself offer. "The guest room is functional, and it would save you an hour of driving each way." Elena considered the offer, weighing practical advantages against the implications of staying overnight on his property. Her decision process was visible in her expression: military pragmatism, balancing personal caution against professional convenience. "That would actually be very helpful," she said. "I could start earlier and finish the whole project tomorrow instead of stretching it into another day." Colt showed her to the guest room that had been his sister's bedroom before she married and moved to Denver. The space was clean but sparse, furnished with essential items but lacking the personal touches that would make it feel welcoming. Elena set her pack on the chair and looked around the room with the observant eye of someone who noticed details about the spaces they occupied. "This is perfect," she said. "More comfortable than most motels, and definitely quieter." They shared dinner at the kitchen table: elk steaks from Colt's freezer, vegetables from the garden that still produced late-season crops, bread Elena had brought from the bakery in town. The conversation flowed easily, covering topics from surveying techniques to ranch management to military experiences that had shaped both their approaches to problem-solving. "The fence system really is impressive," Elena said as they finished eating. "Not just the construction quality, but the systematic approach to perimeter security. You've created something that would challenge anyone who wanted unauthorized access." "Sometimes I wonder if I went overboard," Colt admitted. "Started as practical livestock management and evolved into something more like fortification. Nothing wrong with security if you have reasons for wanting it. After my parents moved away, the isolation became intense. Building fences gave me something to focus on besides the emptiness." Elena nodded as if she understood the relationship between physical construction and psychological healing. "In Afghanistan, we had soldiers who dealt with stress by building elaborate defensive positions. Sometimes the digging was more therapeutic than the protection it provided." "Exactly like that." I told myself every fence improvement was about ranch management, but really it was about creating control over something when everything else felt chaotic. "And now?" Colt considered the question while Elena waited patiently for his answer. The fence system still provided security and defined boundaries, But her presence over the past few days had changed his relationship to the barriers he had constructed so carefully. "Now I'm wondering if maybe I built them too well," he said. "Kept out things that might have been worth letting in." Elena smiled and reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. Good fences make good neighbors, but they shouldn't make neighbors impossible. That evening, they sat on the porch with coffee and talked until the stars emerged in full brilliance. Overhead, Elena knew constellations from navigation training, pointing out stars and planets with the precision of someone who had learned to find direction from celestial markers. Colt shared local weather folklore passed down from his grandfather, predictions based on wind direction and cloud formations that had proven accurate for 70 years. When Elena finally went to bed in the guest room, the house felt different than it had in 5 years of solitary occupation. Not crowded or disrupted, but complete in a way he had forgotten was possible. The presence of someone else moving through familiar spaces, using the bathroom sink, adjusting the thermostat to her preferred temperature, small changes that reminded him the house had been designed for multiple occupants. He lay awake longer than usual, listening to the subtle sounds of the house accommodating a second person. Water running in the guest bathroom, floorboards creaking under unfamiliar footsteps, the quiet sounds of someone settling into sleep in a room that had been empty for too long. For the first time since his parents had moved away, the ranch felt like a home instead of just property to be maintained. Elena's presence didn't threaten the security he had built around himself. It enhanced it by adding the kind of human warmth that no amount of fence construction could provide. Tomorrow, she would finish her survey work and return to whatever other projects waited for her professional attention. But tonight, the carefully guarded boundaries of his isolated world had expanded to include someone who understood the value of both security and human connection. Elena left early the next morning to complete her survey work on the Meadowlark Ranch, wearing his father's jacket and carrying confidence that came from knowing the terrain. Colt watched her truck disappear beyond the ridgeline, then returned to his regular routine with an awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the careful balance he had maintained for 5 years. The change became apparent 2 weeks later when a white SUV with government plates appeared at his south gate on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Colt was replacing insulators on the electric fence when he noticed the vehicle, its occupants studying maps and making notes about his property boundaries. He finished the immediate repair and drove down to meet them, arriving at the gate as 2 men in business suits were photographing his fence construction with expensive cameras. The older man, silver-haired and carrying himself with bureaucratic authority, stepped forward with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Mr. Harrison? I'm Robert Kellerman from the State Environmental Protection Agency, and this is Surveyor Martin Webb from the County Planning Department. We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your property." Colt remained behind the wheel of his truck, engine running, one hand resting on the gear shift. The men's presence felt like an invasion despite their official credentials and polite manner. Whatever had brought them to his gate wasn't going to improve his day. "What kind of concerns?" he asked. Kellerman consulted a folder thick with documents and photographs. "We've received complaints about unauthorized barriers to wildlife migration, potential environmental damage from fence construction, and questions about permits for water diversions. There are also concerns about public access to historically significant Native American sites. This is private property. Has been for 70 years. Private ownership doesn't override federal environmental protection laws or cultural preservation requirements," Webb said, setting up a tablet computer that displayed aerial photographs of the ranch. "Some of your fence construction appears to have been done without proper environmental impact assessments." The photograph showed Colt's property from above, every fence line and building clearly visible, his carefully constructed boundaries mapped with precision that revealed patterns invisible from ground level. Someone had invested considerable Time and resources in documenting his improvements with professional thoroughness. Who filed these complaints? Colt asked. Citizens have the right to report potential environmental violations anonymously, Kellerman said. Our job is to investigate all credible allegations regardless of their source. Colt studied the two men, noting details that Elena's military training would have caught immediately, the way Webb positioned himself to block potential retreat, how Kellerman kept his hands visible but ready to reach for equipment or weapons, their practiced coordination that suggested law enforcement background rather than environmental science. I'll need to see permits for all fence construction completed in the last 5 years. Kellerman continued. Documentation of environmental impact studies, evidence of consultation with tribal authorities about cultural sites, and proof that water diversions comply with state regulations. Water diversions? Webb pointed to aerial photographs that showed the creek system crossing the ranch property, creek channeling, beaver dam modifications, any alterations to natural water flow patterns require state permits. We have reports that unauthorized modifications have affected downstream water availability. The accusations were serious enough to result in substantial fines, construction delays, and potentially forced removal of fence sections that had taken years to build. Worse, they suggested coordination between whoever had filed the complaints and people with enough influence to trigger immediate government response. You'll have 30 days to provide documentation, Kellerman said, handing Colt an official notice with multiple carbon copies. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action, including construction stops and potential legal proceedings. They drove away in their white SUV, leaving Colt alone at his gate with paperwork that threatened everything he had built over 5 years of systematic boundary construction. The notice contained allegations detailed enough to suggest inside knowledge of his property improvements, timing that coincided suspiciously with Alana's recent survey work. That evening, he called the county planning office and reached a receptionist who confirmed that surveyor Martin Webb had indeed been assigned to his case, but couldn't provide details about who had initiated the investigation. The Environmental Protection Agency proved equally unhelpful, citing privacy policies that protected complainants from retaliation. Elena returned to the ranch 3 days later, arriving unannounced in late afternoon with her surveying equipment and the same practical confidence she had shown during her initial visit. Colt met her at the gate with questions that had been building since the government visit. Did you file environmental complaints about my fence construction? He asked without preamble. Elena set down her equipment bag and studied his expression, recognizing the controlled anger of someone who had been blindsided by bureaucratic assault. What kind of complaints? State Environmental Agency showed up Tuesday with allegations about unauthorized barriers to wildlife migration, unpermitted water diversions, and cultural site violations. They want documentation I don't have for work I did under the assumption that I could improve my own property. And you think I reported you? You're the only person who's been on this property in the last 6 months. You surveyed the creek system, studied my fence construction, asked detailed questions about permits and environmental impacts. Elena leaned against her truck and considered his accusations with the analytical approach she applied to complex surveying problems. When did you receive the notice? Tuesday morning. I submitted my creek survey report to the county on Wednesday of last week. Timeline doesn't work if my report triggered an investigation that reached your property 4 days later. Colt felt some of his anger dissipate, replaced by confusion about who else might have access to detailed information about his property improvements. Then who? Show me the notice. They drove to the house where Colt retrieved the environmental protection documents from his kitchen table. Elena read through the allegations with professional attention to detail, occasionally referring to her own surveying notes for comparison. These complaints are very specific, she said after finishing. The documentation. Whoever filed them has detailed knowledge of your fence construction methods, timing of improvements, and environmental impact requirements. This isn't casual neighbor complaints, it's professional sabotage. Professional sabotage? Elena spread the government documents across the kitchen table alongside her own survey maps. Look at the allegations. They cite specific fence sections by legal description, reference construction methods that aren't visible from aerial photography, and demonstrate knowledge of environmental regulations that most people don't understand. Someone with surveying experience, or someone who had access to detailed survey information. Elena pulled out her field notes from the creek mapping project. My reports include elevation data, construction observations, and environmental impact assessments that could provide the basis for these complaints. Colt studied her notes, recognizing locations and fence sections that corresponded exactly to the government allegations. Someone had used Elena's professional survey work as ammunition for an attack, designed to force expensive compliance procedures or substantial property modifications. Who else has access to your reports? County, Planning Department, State Environmental Office, and whoever requested the original survey. Elena flipped through her project files until she found the initial work order. Interesting. The creek mapping project was requested by Meadowlark Ranch Enterprises, not the county. The Sullivans never mentioned needing flood maps. Because it wasn't the Sullivans who requested the survey. Elena showed him the contact information on her work order. Meadowlark Ranch Enterprises is a holding company registered in Wyoming. Want to bet it's connected to development interests rather than agricultural operations? The implications crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. Someone with development plans for the area had commissioned detailed surveys to identify potential obstacles to their projects. Colt's fortress-level fence construction represented exactly the kind of established property improvements that could complicate land acquisition or rezoning applications. They're using your survey work to force me into compliance problems that will be expensive enough to make me consider selling, Colt said. Classic pressure tactic. Create regulatory problems that cost more to resolve than the property is worth, then offer to buy at reduced prices to help with the financial burden. Elena's military intelligence background had taught her to recognize systematic attacks designed to achieve strategic objectives through indirect pressure. The environmental complaints represented coordinated assault rather than legitimate conservation concerns. What can I do? Fight back with better information. Elena opened her laptop and pulled up digital files from her survey work. My reports are accurate and professional, but they can be interpreted selectively to support predetermined conclusions. We need documentation that shows your fence construction actually benefits environmental conservation rather than threatening it. How do we prove that? By conducting a comprehensive environmental impact study that demonstrates positive effects of your improvements. Wildlife protection instead of migration barriers, erosion control instead of habitat destruction, water conservation instead of unauthorized diversions. Elena spent the evening reviewing environmental regulations and compliance requirements, identifying documentation that would counter each allegation in the government notice. Her approach was systematic and thorough, treating the regulatory attack like a military problem that required strategic response rather than defensive reaction. The cultural site allegations are the most serious, she explained while researching federal guidelines on her laptop. If they can prove historical significance for any part of your property, they can impose access requirements that essentially eliminate privacy and security. There are no cultural sites here. My grandfather surveyed every acre before he bought the land, but proving negative evidence is difficult. Better to document positive environmental stewardship that demonstrates responsible land management compatible with cultural preservation. They worked until midnight, Elena drafting response strategies while Colt provided detailed information about his fence construction methods and environmental considerations. Her military training showed in her systematic approach to intelligence. Gathering and strategic planning. We need professional environmental consulting to counter their allegations, Elena concluded. Someone with credentials and experience dealing with regulatory enforcement, who can document the positive impacts of your improvements. That sounds expensive. Cheaper than forced compliance with arbitrary requirements designed to make your property economically unsustainable. The next morning brought another unwelcome visitor, a real estate agent from Billings, who claimed to represent clients interested in purchasing ranch properties for agricultural preservation. His offer was generous but contingent on quick acceptance, with closing dates that would precede any environmental compliance deadlines. Colt declined the offer, but noted the timing correlation between regulatory pressure and acquisition interest. Someone had orchestrated a coordinated campaign designed to force property sales through manufactured compliance crises. We need to identify who's behind Meadowlark Ranch Enterprises, Elena said after the real estate agent departed. Public records should show ownership structures and financial backing. Her research revealed a complex web of holding companies and investment partnerships that eventually traced back to Apex Development Corporation, a firm specializing in luxury resort construction in scenic mountain locations. Their previous projects included ski resorts, hunting lodges, and exclusive residential developments that transformed rural landscapes into profitable entertainment destinations. Resort development explains everything, Elena said, showing Colt aerial photographs of Apex's completed projects. Your property controls access to the most scenic sections of the creek system. They can't build their luxury resort without either acquiring your land or neutralizing your ability to maintain privacy barriers. So they commission survey work that gives them detailed intelligence about my property improvements, then use that information to trigger regulatory enforcement that will force expensive compliance procedures, while simultaneously offering to purchase the property at reduced prices to help with your regulatory problems. Classic leverage acquisition strategy. Elena's analysis revealed the sophistication of the attack against his property and privacy. Apex Development had invested substantial resources in intelligence gathering and regulatory manipulation designed to achieve acquisition goals through indirect pressure rather than direct negotiation. What's our next move? Counterintelligence. Elena smiled with the confidence of someone who had dealt with more dangerous adversaries than development corporations. If they can use professional surveys to create problems, we can use better professional documentation to solve them. She spent the next 2 days conducting detailed environmental assessments that documented the positive impacts of Colt's fence construction on wildlife protection, erosion control, and habitat preservation. Her military training and intelligence analysis proved invaluable for presenting technical information in formats that would satisfy regulatory requirements. Your fence system actually enhances environmental protection, Elena explained, showing Colt photographs and measurements that supported her conclusions. Strategic placement prevents erosion, channels water flow to reduce flood damage, and creates protected corridors that benefit wildlife movement. Will that be enough to counter their allegations? Combined with documentation that proves their survey work was commissioned for development purposes rather than environmental protection, it should shift the regulatory focus from enforcement to investigation of fraudulent complaints. Elena's counterattack strategy transformed offensive responses into offensive documentation that exposed the commercial motivations behind environmental allegations. Her approach demonstrated that military intelligence training could be applied effectively to civilian property defense. The regulatory crisis had strengthened their partnership in ways that peaceful coexistence never could have achieved. Working together against external threats revealed complementary skills and shared values that created bonds deeper than professional respect or personal attraction. I owe you an apology, Colt said as they finished assembling documentation that would counter every environmental allegation. I suspected you of betraying information you had gathered as my guest. Understandable reaction to coordinated attack, Elena replied. Trust is a luxury during active operations. You responded appropriately to perceived threats. Her military terminology reminded him that she viewed their situation as a tactical problem, requiring strategic solutions rather than a personal conflict involving hurt feelings. The crisis had revealed her professional capabilities and personal loyalty in ways that ordinary circumstances never could have demonstrated. What happens next? We submit our documentation to prove environmental compliance, file complaints about fraudulent regulatory manipulation, and prepare for Apex Development to escalate their acquisition pressure through other methods. Elena's prediction proved accurate within days. The environmental allegations were quietly withdrawn after county officials reviewed documentation of fraudulent complaints. But new pressures emerged immediately: utility easement disputes, road access questions, and mineral rights challenges. That suggested coordinated legal assault designed to achieve through litigation what regulatory pressure had failed to accomplish. The battle for his property had expanded beyond fence construction and regulatory compliance into a comprehensive war against well-funded adversaries who viewed his land as an obstacle to profitable development. Elena had proven herself as an invaluable ally whose professional skills and personal loyalty provided resources he could never have assembled alone. The crisis had also revealed that his carefully constructed isolation was no longer sustainable. Against determined opposition, security required alliance with people who possessed complementary capabilities and shared commitment to defending what they had built together. The fortress mentality that had once protected him now needed to evolve into something that could protect them both. The Apex Development assault intensified over the following month, manifesting as a series of carefully orchestrated legal challenges that tested Colt's resolve and depleted his financial reserves. Property tax assessments suddenly tripled based on comparable resort property valuations. Mineral rights claims emerged from dormant mining patents filed decades before his grandfather's purchase. Road access disputes materialized from easement interpretations that had never been questioned in 70 years of Harrison ownership. Elena had moved into the guest room on a temporary basis that stretched into permanent arrangement as the legal battles required constant coordination and documentation. Her presence transformed the ranch house from a fortress of solitude into a command center where two people could plan strategic responses to systematic attacks on everything Colt had spent his life protecting. They're applying classic acquisition pressure techniques, Elena explained one evening as they reviewed the latest legal documents spread across the kitchen table. Multiple simultaneous challenges designed to create financial strain that makes selling appear to be the only rational solution. Her laptop displayed financial projections that calculated the cost of fighting each legal challenge versus the reduced property values that Apex's pressure campaign had already created. The mathematics were designed to be discouraging expenses that would exceed the ranch's agricultural income for years while property values declined under the burden of unresolved legal complications. How long can we sustain this level of legal expense? Colt asked, reviewing attorney bills that had consumed most of his available cash reserves. Depends on how creative we get with our defensive strategies. Elena pulled up documents she had been preparing in consultation with a law firm that specialized in corporate manipulation cases. We can shift from defensive responses to offensive litigation that puts Apex in the position of explaining their acquisition tactics to federal investigators. Her military intelligence background had proven invaluable for understanding corporate warfare techniques and developing counter-strategies that turned aggressor advantages into legal vulnerabilities. She had identified patterns in Apex's acquisition campaigns that suggested violations of federal laws governing commercial fraud and property manipulation. What kind of offensive litigation? RICO violations for organized conspiracy to defraud property owners, SEC violations for fraudulent investment prospectuses, and civil rights violations for systematically targeting rural landowners who lack resources to defend themselves effectively. Elena's research had revealed that Colt's Ranch was only one target in a regional acquisition campaign that had used similar pressure tactics against dozens of property owners across 3 states. The pattern evidence was strong enough to interest federal prosecutors who specialized in corporate fraud cases. The key is demonstrating that our situation represents part of a larger criminal conspiracy rather than isolated property disputes. Elena continued. Individual legal challenges might be expensive to fight, but systematic fraud prosecution becomes a federal priority that shifts costs from victims to perpetrators. She had spent weeks documenting connections between Apex Development's various acquisition targets, identifying common patterns in environmental complaints, regulatory challenges, and financial pressure tactics. Her analysis revealed coordination sophisticated enough to constitute criminal conspiracy under federal racketeering statutes. How do we prove systematic conspiracy? By connecting our case to similar situations where Apex used identical tactics to force property sales. Elena showed him files documenting acquisitions in Colorado, Wyoming, and Idaho where environmental allegations, regulatory challenges, and financial pressure had preceded forced sales to development interests. Same methods, same timing, same legal firms representing the developers. The evidence was compelling enough to attract attention from investigative journalists who specialized in corporate land grab stories. Elena had contacted reporters whose previous work had exposed similar development schemes, providing them with documentation that supported broader investigations into Apex's acquisition practices. Media attention serves 2 purposes, she explained. It creates public pressure for regulatory investigation, and it warns other potential targets about the tactics they're likely to face. Within 2 weeks, the first investigative articles appeared in regional newspapers, describing Apex Development's systematic campaign to acquire scenic properties through manufactured legal challenges and regulatory manipulation. The stories included specific details about environmental fraud, manufactured mineral rights claims, and coordinated pressure tactics that had forced dozens of families to sell property below market value. The media coverage triggered responses that Elena had anticipated based on her military experience with information warfare. Apex Development hired crisis management consultants to control damage from negative publicity while simultaneously accelerating acquisition pressure against current targets who might be influenced by the controversy. They're going to escalate before the federal investigation can gain momentum, Elena predicted. Expect maximum pressure over the next few weeks as they try to close pending acquisitions before criminal charges become public. Her prediction proved accurate within days. Colt received notice that his property tax assessment had been increased again, this time to levels that would require selling cattle to cover annual obligations. Mineral rights claims expanded to include water rights that would eliminate his ability to irrigate pastures or maintain livestock operations. Road access disputes escalated to include claims that his fence construction blocked emergency vehicle access required by county safety regulations. They're trying to make the property economically unsustainable before federal prosecutors can intervene, Elena said, reviewing the latest round of legal challenges. Classic scorched earth tactics designed to force immediate decisions. But Elena's counteroffensive strategy had also gained momentum. The FBI had opened an investigation into Apex Development's acquisition practices based on evidence she had provided about systematic fraud. State environmental agencies had begun investigating the source of fraudulent environmental complaints that had triggered enforcement actions against multiple property owners. Local news coverage had generated political pressure for county officials to examine their role in facilitating questionable development schemes. The tide is turning. Elena announced after receiving updates from federal investigators and journalists covering the story. Apex is facing criminal investigation, civil lawsuits from previous acquisition targets, and regulatory scrutiny that will make future operations much more difficult. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martin Webb, the county surveyor who had participated in the initial environmental investigation, contacted Elena with information about pressure he had received to fabricate compliance violations against properties targeted for Apex acquisition. He's willing to testify about instructions he received to find environmental violations, regardless of actual compliance status, Elena reported after meeting with Webb and federal investigators. His testimony provides direct evidence of criminal conspiracy to defraud property owners through fraudulent regulatory enforcement. Webb's cooperation opened investigative paths that revealed the full scope of Apex's acquisition scheme. County officials had been pressured to expedite regulatory challenges against targeted properties. Environmental consultants had been hired to file fraudulent complaints that would trigger enforcement actions. Legal firms had been coordinated to file simultaneous challenges that would overwhelm individual property owners' ability to respond effectively. The criminal case is strong enough that Apex will face federal prosecution, regardless of what happens with individual property disputes, Elena explained. But we still need to resolve the specific challenges against your ranch to eliminate ongoing financial pressure. The resolution came through a combination of legal victories and strategic negotiation. Environmental allegations were dismissed after investigation revealed fraudulent basis for the original complaints. Mineral rights claims were defeated through documentation that Elena had discovered in historical mining records. Property tax assessments were reduced to reasonable levels after county officials reviewed the comparable property analysis that had justified excessive valuations. Most importantly, we've established legal precedents that will make similar attacks much more difficult in the future, Elena said as they reviewed the final settlement documents. Apex Development has agreed to cease acquisition activities in this region as part of their federal plea agreement. The legal victory represented more than successful defense of Colt's property rights. It had established Elena as an essential partner whose professional capabilities and personal commitment had made survival possible against adversaries who had defeated dozens of other property owners. I couldn't have fought this alone, Colt admitted as they celebrated the end of the legal challenges with dinner at the kitchen table, where they had planned their defense strategy. They would have bankrupted me within 6 months if you hadn't been here to organize the counterattack. Military intelligence training finally proved useful for something besides mapping enemy positions, Elena replied. Though corporate fraud investigation isn't that different from tactical analysis, same pattern recognition, same strategic thinking, same attention to detail that can reveal vulnerabilities in seemingly strong positions. The crisis had transformed their relationship from tentative friendship into essential partnership. Elena's presence had evolved from temporary professional consultation to permanent personal commitment that neither of them questioned, despite its implications for the independent lifestyles they had both carefully constructed. What happens now? Colt asked, recognizing that victory over Apex Development had eliminated the external pressure that had initially justified Elena's extended residence at the ranch. Now we decide what we want to build together instead of just what we're fighting to protect. Elena's answer acknowledged that their partnership had grown beyond crisis response into something that could sustain itself through ordinary circumstances as well as extraordinary challenges. The ranch had become their shared project rather than his solitary responsibility. I've been thinking about that, Colt said. The fence system was designed for one person defending against everything. Maybe it's time to redesign it for two people building something together. Elena smiled at his recognition that defensive barriers could be transformed into constructive boundaries that included rather than excluded the people who mattered. What kind of modifications did you have in mind? gates instead of walls, access points for people we want to welcome instead of barriers designed to keep everyone out, selective permeability instead of absolute exclusion. Exactly. Security that protects what we value without preventing us from sharing it with people who understand its importance. They spent the evening planning modifications to the fence system that would maintain security while creating controlled access for guests, contractors, and other visitors who might contribute to ranch operations, rather than threatening them. Elena's surveying expertise proved valuable for designing entry points that would provide convenience without compromising defensive advantages. We should also consider expanding operations, Elena suggested. The ranch is large enough to support diversified activities that would make it more economically sustainable and personally fulfilling. What kind of diversification? Professional surveying services based here could provide income while utilizing my expertise in ways that complement ranch management. Consulting on fence construction and property security could share your knowledge with people facing similar challenges. Elena's proposals represented integration of their professional capabilities into shared enterprise that would strengthen rather than complicate their personal relationship. The ranch could become the base for activities that utilized both their skills while maintaining the independence and security they both valued. "There's something else we should discuss," Colt said, recognizing that their partnership deserved formal recognition that reflected its importance to both their futures. "I was hoping you'd bring that up." Elena reached across the table to take his hand, acknowledging the unspoken question that had grown increasingly obvious during their months of shared challenges and daily cooperation. "I know we approached this backwards living together before. Dating, fighting corporate lawyers before having normal conversations about what we want from each other. Military relationships often develop under pressure," Elena said. "Sometimes extraordinary circumstances reveal compatibility more accurately than ordinary dating situations. And what have extraordinary circumstances revealed about our compatibility? That we work well together under stress, that we respect each other's professional capabilities, and that we both value building something lasting more than pursuing temporary satisfaction." Her assessment was practical and romantic in equal measure, acknowledging both the functional advantages of their partnership and the emotional bonds that had developed through shared challenges and mutual respect. "So when this is all settled, when the legal challenges are finished and the ranch is secure, you'll stay?" "If you want me to stay, yes. This place has become home in ways I didn't expect when I first crossed your fence line." Elena's acceptance felt like the completion of a construction project that had taken years to plan and months to execute. The ranch would remain secure and private, but it would no longer be isolated or lonely. The barriers he had built to keep the world out had been transformed into boundaries that protected what they had built together. "Then let's make it official," Colt said, reaching into his shirt pocket for a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, kept in his dresser drawer for years with no expectation that he would ever have occasion to offer it to someone who would understand its significance. "Colt Harrison, are you proposing to me at the kitchen table where we planned legal warfare against corporate developers? I'm proposing to you at the kitchen table where we discovered we could face anything together and come out stronger than either of us could have managed alone." Elena accepted the ring and the proposal with the same practical confidence she had shown when crossing his fence line that first morning in the fog. "Then yes, I accept your proposal and your partnership and your ranch and your fences and everything else that comes with sharing a life in the middle of nowhere, Montana, including 12 miles of fence line that need constant maintenance, especially the fence line. Someone has to make sure you don't go overboard with the security improvements again." They spent their engagement evening walking the fence line closest to the house, checking wire tension and post stability by flashlight, while making plans for modifications that would reflect their shared ownership and joint commitment to protecting what they had built together. The barriers that had once isolated Colt from human connection had become the key foundation for a partnership that enhanced rather than threatened his security and independence. The ranch would remain their fortress, but it would be a fortress occupied by two people who had chosen to face the world together rather than separately. Elena's presence had transformed defensive isolation into selective community, protective barriers into welcoming boundaries, and solitary survival into shared prosperity. The fences would still keep things out, but they would also keep precious things safely in. 6 months after Elena's acceptance of Colt's proposal, the Ironwood Ranch had transformed in ways that honored its past while embracing possibilities neither of them had imagined during their first meeting in the fog. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning beneath the cottonwoods along the creek, with only essential witnesses: Colt's parents who had driven from Billings, Elena's sister from Minneapolis, and the handful of neighbors who had supported them during the legal battles against Apex Development. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate the practical boots that remained essential for navigating ranch terrain, even on formal occasions. Colt stood beneath trees his grandfather had planted, wearing his father's suit jacket with new modifications that Elena had designed to accommodate the broader shoulders that came from years of fence construction and ranch work. The ceremony was performed by Judge Martinez from the county courthouse, the same judge who had presided over the final legal victories that had secured their property rights and sent Apex Development executives to federal prison. His presence represented both legal validation of their marriage and symbolic closure of the corporate warfare that had forged their partnership under fire. Elena Vasquez and Colt Harrison, Judge Martinez pronounced, having demonstrated your commitment to each other through circumstances that would have challenged any partnership, you are now legally joined in marriage as well as practically united in all the ventures you choose to pursue together. The reception took place in the ranch yard, where tables constructed from fence posts and barn lumber supported food, prepared by Elena's military friends who had driven from bases across the Mountain West to celebrate with the surveyor who had found love in the Montana wilderness. Colt's cattlemen neighbors contributed beef from their herds and stories about the ranch's history that stretched back to homestead days when community cooperation was essential for survival. To Elena and Colt, toasted Captain Sarah Chun, Elena's former commanding officer who had flown in from Fort Carson, who proved that the best partnerships are forged by people who can fight together as effectively as they can build together. The celebration continued until well after sunset, with music provided by Elena's cousin, who had brought guitar and violin from Minneapolis, and dancing on a platform that Colt had constructed from lumber salvaged during fence modifications. The evening felt like the completion of a construction project years in the planning, every detail carefully considered, every element serving both practical and symbolic purposes. As their guests departed the next morning, Elena and Colt found themselves alone on the ranch for the first time since the crisis that had brought them together. The legal battles were finished, the property was secure, and their partnership had been officially recognized by law and community. They could finally focus on building the future they had planned during long evenings of strategic discussion and shared dreams. What's our first priority as an officially married ranch management team? Elena asked as they cleaned up the reception area that would be restored to its normal function as equipment storage and cattle handling space. Completing the fence modifications we designed, Colt replied, indicating survey stakes that marked planned changes to the access system, security barriers that welcomed the right people instead of excluding everyone. The fence modification project had become their first joint construction effort, combining Colt's expertise in barrier construction with Elena's knowledge of traffic flow and access control. They were installing a new gate system that would provide controlled entry for business visitors, emergency services, and social guests while maintaining security against unwanted intrusion. Elena had designed electronic access controls that could be operated remotely, allowing them to grant entry to expected visitors without compromising security or requiring physical presence at the gate. The system represented evolution from fortress mentality to selective hospitality, barriers that could be permeable when appropriate while remaining impermeable when necessary. The surveying business is ready to launch as soon as the gate system is operational, Alina reported, showing Colt contracts she had negotiated with county agencies and private clients who needed professional mapping services. 3 major projects are already scheduled, with potential for expansion if we can establish a reputation for quality work and reliable completion. Her surveying enterprise would operate from a renovated section of the barn, equipped with modern instruments and computer systems that could handle complex mapping projects while maintaining the ranch's agricultural functions. The business would provide income diversification while utilizing her professional skills in ways that complemented rather than competed with ranch operations. And the consulting work on property security? 5 inquiries from ranchers who read about our legal victory and want advice on protecting their operations from similar development pressure, Colt said. Enough potential business to justify expanding the workshop for custom fence construction. His security consulting had emerged naturally from their success in defending against apex development. Other rural property owners faced similar pressures from development interests, mining companies, and government agencies that viewed private land as obstacles to commercial projects. Colt's expertise in defensive construction and Alina's knowledge of legal strategy provided valuable services for people who lacked resources to develop comprehensive security on their own. The workshop expansion would occupy the equipment shed that had been underutilized since Colt reduced his cattle operation to focus on property maintenance. Alina had designed modifications that would accommodate specialized tools for custom fence construction while providing space for the precision instruments required for professional surveying work. Integrated operations that support each other instead of competing for resources, Alina observed. Reviewing architectural plans that showed how their individual specialties could be combined into efficient shared enterprise. Your grandfather would approve of diversification that strengthens the ranch instead of replacing it. They spent the following months implementing business plans while completing personal projects that reflected their joint ownership of the property. Alina planted gardens that would provide vegetables for their table and herbs for preservation and cooking. Colt built furniture from timber harvested on their land, creating pieces that would last generations while utilizing resources that might otherwise be wasted. The interior of the ranch house evolved to accommodate 2 people with different needs and preferences while maintaining the essential character that connected it to family history. Alina's books joined Colt's on shelves his father had built. Her surveying equipment shared space with ranch management records in the office that had been his grandfather's sanctuary for planning and record-keeping. The house feels complete now, Colt's mother observed during a visit that spring. Not just occupied, but truly lived in by people who understand what makes it special. Helen Harrison had been skeptical about her son's sudden marriage to a woman she had never met, but Alina's respectful integration into family traditions and ranch operations had won approval that was difficult to earn. She appreciated Alina's competence, respected her military service, and valued her obvious commitment to preserving, rather than changing the essential character of the property. Alina understands that this place has history that deserves respect. Helen continued, watching her daughter-in-law adjust irrigation systems with the careful attention of someone who intended to maintain them for decades. She's not trying to replace what came before, just adding her own contributions to what already exists. The spring also brought their first major test as business partners, when the county commissioned a comprehensive survey of the entire watershed system that included their property and dozen neighboring ranches. The project required coordinating multiple survey teams, managing complex logistics, and producing reports that would affect water rights and property values across 3 counties. Alina managed the technical aspects, while Colt handled property, access negotiations, and community relations. Their partnership proved effective for complex projects that required both specialized expertise and local knowledge, diplomatic skills, and technical precision. "We're good at this," Alina announced after completing the watershed survey ahead of schedule and under budget. "Professional competence plus community trust plus efficient coordination equals competitive advantage that larger firms can't duplicate." The success of the watershed project generated additional contracts that established their reputation for quality work and reliable completion. Alina's military training in project management, combined with Colt's lifetime of ranch experience, created capabilities that served clients who needed both technical accuracy and practical understanding of rural conditions. By their first anniversary, the business operations had exceeded financial projections while enhancing rather than compromising their personal relationship. Alina's surveying work provided steady income that reduced dependence on cattle markets, while Colt's security consulting generated projects that utilized his construction skills and property management knowledge. "We've created something sustainable," Alina observed as they reviewed annual financial reports that showed diversified income sources and steadily increasing property values. Multiple revenue streams that support each other while maintaining the agricultural foundation that makes this place special. The anniversary celebration was smaller than their wedding, but more personally meaningful dinner for two on the porch, where Colt had spent years watching sunsets alone, followed by a walk around the fence line that now marked the boundaries of their shared enterprise rather than his solitary fortress. "Do you ever miss the isolation?" Alina asked as they paused at the spring crossing where she had first damaged his fence during her morning navigation through fog. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," Colt admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness or the defensiveness or the feeling that everything was always at risk because I was handling it alone. And I don't miss the uncertainty of never knowing where my next assignment would take me or whether I'd find another place that felt like home," Alina replied. "This is better than anything I imagined when I was mapping foreign countries for people who would never see the terrain I was documenting." They had reached the ridge that overlooked the entire ranch, fence lines visible as geometric patterns that organized natural landscape into managed sections. The barriers remained functional and secure, but they no longer felt like prison walls or fortress fortifications. They had become boundaries that defined home rather than refuge, territory that was shared rather than defended. "What's next for us?" Colt asked, recognizing that their partnership had achieved stability that allowed planning beyond immediate survival and crisis management. "Expansion," Alina said, pointing toward the neighboring property that had been abandoned since its elderly owners moved to assisted living facilities. "The Meadowlark Ranch is available for lease with an option to purchase. We could extend our operations across drainage systems that would triple our surveying capabilities and provide enough additional pasture to justify expanding cattle operations." The abandoned ranch represented an opportunity that neither of them could have pursued individually, but that their partnership made financially feasible and operationally practical. Alina's business income could support the lease payments while Colt's ranch management skills could restore productivity to land that had been neglected for years. "Ambitious expansion for people who got married less than a year ago," Colt observed. "Military training teaches you to recognize strategic opportunities and act on them before circumstances change," Alina replied. "We have financial stability, professional reputation, and partnership skills that can handle complex projects. The question is whether we want to remain at our current scale or grow into something larger." "Larger, but not different," Colt said, understanding that expansion could enhance their enterprise without changing its essential character. "More of what we're already doing well instead of branching into activities that would require capabilities we don't have." "Exactly. Scaled growth that utilizes our strengths without demanding expertise we haven't developed." They spent the summer negotiating lease agreements and planning integration of the Meadowlark property into their operations. Alina surveyed the additional land while Colt assessed infrastructure requirements for managing expanded cattle operations and maintaining security across larger territory. The project represented their largest joint undertaking since the legal battles against apex development, requiring coordination of surveying work, fence construction, business planning, and financial management that tested every aspect of their partnership. But it also demonstrated how effectively they could combine individual expertise into shared enterprise that achieved results neither could have accomplished alone. "We're building something that will last," Alina announced when they signed the final purchase agreement that made them owners of nearly 6,000 acres of some of the finest ranch land in Montana. "Not just for us, but for whatever family we decide to create and whatever legacy we want to leave." The mention of family represented acknowledgement of possibilities they had discussed privately, but never addressed formally. Alina was 34, Colt was 36, and their partnership had reached stability that could support expansion beyond business operations into personal dimensions they had postponed during the challenging early phases of their relationship. "Are you ready for that kind of expansion?" Colt asked, recognizing that children would transform their carefully organized operations in ways that required different planning and different priorities. "Military experience teaches contingency planning for situations you can't completely control," Alina replied. "But it also teaches you that some risks are worth taking when the potential benefits justify the challenges they might create." Their second winter as married partners was spent planning modifications that would accommodate family life while maintaining business operations and ranch productivity. Alina designed home improvements that would provide space for children without compromising the workshop and office areas essential for their professional activities. Colt planned fence modifications that would create safe play areas while maintaining security perimeters that protected against wildlife and unauthorized intrusion. "We're designing for a future we can't completely predict," Alina observed as they reviewed architectural plans during long evenings when snow prevented outdoor work. "But that's not different from military planning or ranch management or any other activity that requires preparing for conditions you can influence but not control." Spring brought confirmation that their family expansion plans would be implemented sooner than expected. Alina's pregnancy was discovered during a routine medical appointment, generating excitement tempered by practical concerns about managing business operations and ranch responsibilities while preparing for parenthood. "Perfect timing," Alina announced with characteristic optimism. "Due date in November means I can complete the current surveying projects before winter weather makes field work difficult, and the baby will arrive when ranch operations are at minimum intensity." Colt's response was quieter but equally positive. Recognizing that fatherhood would require modifications to routines that had been optimized for maximum efficiency rather than family accommodation. "We'll need to adjust work schedules and business travel, but the fundamental operations can continue without major disruption." The pregnancy progressed smoothly while they completed business projects and ranch improvements that would provide foundation for family life. Alina continued surveying work through her 7th month, adapting field techniques to accommodate physical changes, while maintaining professional standards that had established their reputation for quality work. Colt modified fence systems to create child-safe areas around the house and barn, installing barriers that would prevent accidents while allowing supervised access to ranch activities that could provide education and entertainment for children who would grow up understanding agricultural life and land management responsibilities. Their daughter was born on a snowy November morning, arriving with the punctuality that Alina had predicted and the robust health that suggested adaptation to high-altitude ranch life. They named her Sarah Marie Harrison, honoring Alina's military mentor and Colt's grandmother, while creating an identity that belonged completely to the next generation. She's perfect, Elena whispered as they sat together in the hospital room, watching snow fall past windows that framed mountains they could see from their ranch porch. And she's going to love growing up where she can learn to build fences and read maps and understand that land ownership means stewardship responsibility. She learned that home means something worth protecting, Colt added, holding his daughter with hands that had built thousands of fence posts and understanding that everything he had constructed was ultimately for her. Inheritance and security. The ranch that had once been a fortress for one lonely man had become a foundation for family enterprise that honored the past while embracing the future. Elena's arrival had transformed defensive barriers into protective boundaries, isolation into selective community, and survival into prosperity that could be shared across generations. As they drove home from the hospital with their newborn daughter, the fence lines that marked their property boundaries looked different than they had when Colt first built them in solitude. They remained strong and secure, but they no longer excluded the world. They simply defined the space where a family could build something lasting together. The gates were locked against uninvited intrusion, but they opened easily for people who understood the value of what lay beyond the barriers. Elena had taught Colt that the strongest fences were built not to keep everything out, but to protect everything that mattered most. And what mattered most was no longer just the land, but the people who would carry its legacy forward long after the current generation had passed into memory, and new hands had learned to maintain the boundaries that made home possible in an uncertain world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.